when her father died. Verity Sutton's two older brothers took everything he owned. The 200-acre farm in the Holston Valley, the hardwood timber rights, the bank accounts, the trucks, the hay equipment. All Verity received was a small stone and cedar smokehouse on a 1.2-acre corner of the farm that her brothers had been planning to bulldoze for years. They laughed at the smokehouse the night the will was read. To them, it was a forgotten outbuilding from another century, fit only for kindling. But what none of them knew was that hidden beneath the floor of that small smokehouse was something their grandmother had protected for nearly 50 years, something that would expose a family secret the brothers had never been told, something that would answer a question Verity had carried since she was 14. And by the time she understood what the smokehouse really held, she would realize that her father had not given her the smallest share. He had given her the only share that mattered. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Verity Sutton was 24 years old the November morning the family attorney read her father's will. She sat at the far end of a long walnut conference table in a small law office on Main Street in Greenville, Tennessee, wearing the only black dress she owned and a faded forest gray wool Melton jacket she had inherited from her grandmother. Across the table sat her two older brothers, Garrett Sutton, 39, and Wade Sutton, 35. Garrett had flown in from Nashville the night before in a slate gray wool suit that had not creased on the plane. Wade had driven up from Knoxville in a new dual-cab pickup. Beside Garrett sat his wife, Breen Sutton, who had been a stranger to Verity for 11 years and had not stopped looking at her phone for the last 20 minutes. Beside Wade sat nobody. He was on his third marriage, and the third wife was no longer speaking to any of them. The attorney, Mr. Otis Penland, was 68, the same age her father had been, and had known her father since the two were boys at Tusculum School. Mr. Penland read the will in the slow, careful Tennessee mountain voice of a man who had read 3,000 wills and had learned a long time ago that the best service he could do for a grieving family was to let the document speak for itself and not flinch when one of them began to cry. Nobody cried that morning. Verity watched her brothers' faces as the attorney moved through the document. The 200-acre Sutton home farm in the Holston Valley, including the dwelling house, 3 barns and all attached improvements, divided equally between Garrett and Wade. The 1947 Massey Harris tractor, the 1960 John Deere, the round baler, the bush hog, divided equally. The standing hardwood timber on the back 40, valued at $130,000 at the last cruise, divided equally. The First Bank of Greenville accounts, the Sun Trust accounts, the federal and bank certificates, divided equally. Garrett's pen scratched a quiet line under each item. Wade leaned back in his chair and smiled. Then Mr. Penland turned the page and read the small bequest. To my daughter, Verity Marlene Sutton, I leave the 1 to 10 acre parcel at the northeast corner of the home farm, including the small stone smokehouse built by my grandfather, Caleb Sutton, in 1909, and all contents thereof. Mr. Penland paused. He looked up over his reading glasses. He folded his hands. Garrett let out a short laugh. Wade laughed harder. He left her the meat shed, Wade said. Daddy left her the meat shed. Garrett tapped his pen on his pad. There's nothing in it. The shingles are falling off the chimney lanes. We were going to push it over and grade the corner for the new hay shed. Breen, who had finally looked up from her phone, asked Garrett, "How much is that acre worth?" Garrett shrugged. 12,000 maybe. Less the cost of taking the smokehouse down. Wade laughed again. He turned to Verity. You got the meat. Shed. V. Congratulations, Mr. Penland did not laugh. He looked at Verity over the top of his glasses for a long moment, and there was something in his eyes that the brothers did not see. He looked like a man who had been waiting 20 years to see how this particular moment would land. He cleared his throat and read the remaining administrative paragraphs and the signature lines and the witness names. Verity signed her acceptance. Her brothers signed theirs. The meeting was over in 41 minutes. What her brothers did not know, what nobody at that table except Mr. Penland knew, was that Verity Sutton had been raised in that smokehouse from the time she was 4 years old. Her grandmother, Mavis Sutton, born Mavis Stipton, had taken her on every Saturday and every summer afternoon of her childhood and had taught her the smokehouse straight hand by hand, exactly the way Mavis herself had been taught at the same building by her own father. The smokehouse had been the only place in the whole 200-acre Sutton holding where Verity had ever felt completely at home. Her brothers had never been inside it. Garrett, who was 15 years older, had been at boarding school in Knoxville from the time Verity was 3. Wade, 11 years older, had spent every minute of his childhood with their father in the barns and the fields and had no interest in what Mavis called the back corner trade. The smokehouse had been her grandmother's domain. After Mavis died, when Verity was 14, the smokehouse had been padlocked by her father and not opened by anyone again. Verity's mother, Marlene Sutton, had died of breast cancer the year Verity was 12 after a 4-year fight that had drained the household. Her father, Hollis Sutton, 68 at his death, had been a hard, quiet man who had spoken to Verity perhaps 500 words a year for the 10 years since her mother died. And most of those words had been about chores. Hollis had not been cold. He had been broken. Oh, loved Marlene in the slow and articulate way that mountain men love their wives. And her death had taken something out of him that he had never been able to put back. After Mavis died 2 years later, he had grown quieter still. Verity had grown up between her father's silence and her grandmother's slow, patient afternoons in the smokehouse. And the silence and the smokehouse had divided her childhood into distinct halves. The half she endured and the half she lived. Mavis Sutton had been a smoked ham maker on the Sutton home farm for 46 years, from 1960 to when she married Caleb Sutton's grandson Hollis's father, Buford, until her death in 2008. Mavis had inherited the smokehouse and the smoke trade from her own father, Mr. Tipton, who had walked from Scotland to Pennsylvania in 1898 with a packet of family ham recipes folded in his coat lining and had worked his way down the Great Wagon Road into the Tennessee hills, where he had taken a job at Caleb Sutton's smokehouse in 1908 and married Caleb's only daughter, Bertha, in 1911. By the spring of 1909, Caleb Sutton, Verity's great-grandfather, a Scots-Irish smallholder who had bought the original 200 acres of bottom lawn from a railroad agent for $310 in 1903, had built the small stone and cedar smokehouse with his own hands at the northeast corner of the farm. He had laid the lower 3 ft of wall and dry-stacked fieldstone, the upper 4 ft in clear cedar plank, the roof in splits late hauled from a quarry near Irwin. He had set the brick smoke firebox at the center of the south wall and had run a vent flue through the roof. He had built the heavy maple curing table along the north wall out of 110 and thick slab of C's and hard maple that he had jointed and pegged himself. The first country ham that came off Caleb Sutton's curing table was a 14-pound, sugar-cured shoulder for a Greenville banker in November of 1909. and the Smokehouse had cured hams without missing a season from then until October of 2008. By 6, Verity could grade salt cure by feel. Mavis had taught her the cuts of the trade, the difference between short cure, 6 weeks all trub followed by 90-day hang used for table ham, and long cure, 6 months all trub then 12-month hang used for prosciutto style-aged country ham. The difference between belly bacon smoke, sweet finish, and jowl bacon smoke, sharp finish. The difference between first day fire, raw smoke at 60 with damp hickory chips for color, and second day fire smoke at 100 with apple wood for flavor. By 8, Mavis let her hand rub the salt cure into a fresh ham at the maple curing table. A small girl working the brown sugar and kosher salt mixture into the cold pink meat with a slow even pressure her grandmother had taught her. A patience, honey girl, Mavis would say. Patience. The cure does not soak in from your strength. It soaks in from the time. One slow rub at a time. The meat is patient. So are you. By 10, Verity was tending the firebox on her own through a full afternoon, feeding hickory chunks into the brick chamber, watching the smoke rise pale blue through the rack, never letting the heat climb past 90. The first full ham she finished entirely on her own. Salted, smoked aged, was a 12-pound sugar cured for a Greenville restaurant in 2010, and Mavis had weighed the wrapped ham on the brass spring scale, and folded the tag and laid it on the shelf, and turned to the next ham without a word. She had not needed to speak. Verity had glowed for a week. Mavis taught her the failures too. It was a thing she called the false cure. It was a ham that looked rubbed and cured from the outside, the salt evenly distributed, the surface dry, the color right, but where the cure had failed to penetrate the inner muscle near the bone, because the rubber had pressed too hard at the surface and sealed the salt out of the deep meat. Such a ham would hang on the rack alongside its neighbors all through the 90-day aging. By the 4th month, the meat near the bone would begin to spoil from the inside out, and one slice through the ham at table would show a gray ring around the bone that no chef would forgive. If you pressed too hard on the cure, honey girl, Mavis said, holding up a small carved ham bone. She kept on the bench for exactly this kind of teaching. The ham will look like a ham for months. By the 5th, the man who bought it from us will slice it at his Easter table and find the gray ring at the bone, and he will never buy another ham from us as long as he leaves. You cannot recover the bone. You cannot recover the time. You cannot recover the trust. Do you understand what we are losing? Verity had nodded. She was 12 that summer. From that morning forward, she rubbed the salt cure with the lightest possible pressure of her flat palms, and she watched the cure work its way into the meat through patience and not through force. She never sent a false cured ham out the door. Mavis taught her to read the smoke with her eyes. Wood smoke was not one thing, Mavis said. It was a moving column of moisture and tar and aromatic compounds that changed color and weight depending on the wood, the fire temperature, the firebox draft, and the humidity in the smokehouse air. The keeper who could read the smoke with her eyes could tell by the way the column rose and curled at the vent whether the fire was running too hot, too dry, or just right. To watch the smoke. Honey girl, not the fire. The smoke. If it goes up gray and lazy and curls back into the smokehouse, your fire is to dampen your ham, is going to taste like mud. If it goes up white and fast and straight, your fire is too hot and your ham is going to taste like burnt trope. If it goes up pale blue, slow, climbing without curling, your fire is right. Pale blue smoke. Always pale blue. By 13, Verity could glance up at the smokehouse vent in the middle of an afternoon and call the fire condition within 10 seconds. Mavis tested her sometimes. by asking her to read the smoke from 100 ft away across the farmyard. She had never gotten it wrong. By 14, Verity was running the smokehouse on Saturdays through the summer alone, while Mavis sat in a cane chair beside the curing table with her arthritis bad. By 15, she could grate a finished country ham at a glance and tell by the marbled exterior bloom, and the slight give under the thumb whether it was ready for slicing or needed more months of hang. By 16, she could mortar the firebox brick with high-temperature clay mix, a skill that took most apprentices 5 years to learn cleanly. By 17, she was wrapping finished hams in cotton muslin and tagging them with the brass corner crimp her grandmother had taught her. 300 hams a season for the Greenville restaurants and country grocers who bought from the smokehouse. The trade had become her body. She did not yet think of it as a trade. To her, it was simply what one did on Saturdays and summer afternoons in a stone and cedar building with one's grandmother. Mavis taught her the seasons of the trade. In November, when the cold weather came down out of the Bald Mountains and the hogs were slaughtered on the neighbor farms, you bought your year's pork shoulders and bellies in fresh. 20 hams, 20 bellies, 10 jowls, and you began the salt cure that same week. In December and January and February, you rubbed the cures and hung the meat. In March and April, you ran the cold smoke fires daily. In May, the warm smoke fires came on. From June through September, the hams hung in the cooled arc of the smokehouse aging, and you turned them once a week and watched for surface mold and trimmed it off with a stiff brush. By October, the year's hams came out of the smokehouse one at a time, wrapped and tagged and ready, and you delivered them to your buyers. Then in November, the next year's pork came in and you began again. There were stories from the trade Mavis would tell while her hands worked at the curing table. A story about Mrs. Idabel Renfro, who had run the kitchen at Bailey's Steakhouse on Main Street in Greenville for 34 years, and had bought a 12-pound sugar-cured ham from Mavis every Christmas Eve from 1968 through 2007, paid in cash, never a check. She had wept on the porch, the December of 2007 when Mavis told her she was raising her price from $40 to $48. Not over the $6 but over the slow disappearance of a Tennessee mountain, food culture she had known her whole life. The story of the long farm crisis of 1986, when nearly half the small farms in Greene County had gone under in a single winter to the federal and bank foreclosure auctions, and Mavis and her husband Buford had quietly sold an extra 40 hams a month at cost out the back door of the smokehouse, paid for by the Greenville restaurants at double the normal price, and had used every dollar of the extra income to anonymously pay down the mortgages of 7 neighbor families nobody else would help. Verity had not known this story. She had heard pieces of it. She had not known the number. The story of a winter in 1990, one when a young Mexican-American woman from Hamblin County had walked the lane to the smokehouse with a 6-month-old son strapped to her chest, asking work, and Mavis had given her a winter's wage and taught her to read the smoke in 9 weeks. The woman had gone on to start her own smokehouse near Androgen, had named her business Mavis Sutton's Apprentice. Mavis told her stories that were really lessons. Once, when Verity was 11 and had asked why her grandmother bothered curing hams by hand when a vacuum-packed Smithfield ham could be had at the Food City for $19 and never needed any aging, Mavis had set down the brass salt rub she was working with, turned to her and said, "A factory ham is a product. A cured ham is a promise. When you eat a slice of country ham from this smokehouse, you are eating the hickory that fell in the Bald Mountains last spring, and the apple wood that pruned out of Mr. Jenks's orchard in February, and the salt that came up out of a Virginia mine in October, and the patience of a woman who turned the ham once a week for 13 months. There are people in this country who still want to taste what they are eating. The hams are for them. That is also the trade. The hams are how we pay back the people who still want to know where their food came from. Verity had understood this without being able to say it. The hams were a promise. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever tasted a true Appalachian country ham? Sliced thin, salt bright, sweet at the bone, and felt the place it came from come alive on your tongue. Mavis died in October of 2008 in her own bed in the small farmhouse on the home place of a stroke in her sleep. Verity was 11. Hollis Sutton had buried his mother in the small Sutton family cemetery on the rise above the home farm and had walked down to the smokehouse the next morning and padlocked the door himself. For 13 years the smokehouse had stood untouched. Verity had been told, gently but firmly, that the smokehouse was closed. She had walked past it every summer of her childhood and looked at the padlocked door and the silvering cedar plank and the slate roof gone soft with moss. And she had made herself a promise without yet having the words for it. The week of her father's funeral, Verity had moved out of the house she had been renting with 3 other waitresses in Greenville and into the small back bedroom at the Sutton home farm. The bedroom her father had told her, on a thin winter Tuesday in February, she was welcome to use for as long as she wanted. Hollis had been dead 3 weeks when she moved in. Garrett and Wade had come down for the weekend, walked the farm with the real estate agent, taken photographs of every barn and tractor and outbuilding, and driven back to their cities by Sunday afternoon. Garrett had told her, on the porch that Sunday, that the home farm would be listed for sale by spring and that she should plan on being out by April 1st. He had not asked where she would go. Verity had not answered him. She had stood on the porch with her hands in the pockets of the gray wool jacket and watched her brother's trucks roll down the lane and turn east toward Knoxville. The Monday after the will reading, Verity drove out the lane in her 1996 Ford F-150, the only thing she had bought entirely with her own money, paid $1,750 in cash to a man on Route 70 outside Moshin, and she parked in the gravel turnaround at the northeast corner of the home farm, where the small smokehouse stood. She had not been inside it in 13 years. She had only ever stood at the padlocked door and looked at the iron lock and the small brass key her grandmother had hung on a string above the door, that Hollis had taken down the day Mavis was buried. She did not have the key. She walked across the gravel turnaround in the November morning light and stood at the padlocked door and breathed for a long minute. Then she fetched the key from inside the inside pocket of the gray wool jacket. Mr. Otis Spanland had handed her the key in a small envelope after the will reading with no comment. The envelope had been sealed with red wax. She had carried it home. She had not opened it until that morning. She fitted the small brass key to the padlock. The lock gave. She lifted it off. She leaned her shoulder against the cedar door and pushed it inward. The door swung on its hinges with a soft scrape. The smokehouse was still there. The brick firebox at the center of the south wall, cold and clean as the day Hollis had locked it. The wrought iron hanging beam, running the length of the ceiling, the brass hooked hangers all empty. The heavy maple curing table along the north wall. The surface darkened by 99 years of salt rubbed into the grain. The cedar plank smoke racks above the curing table empty. The slate floor swept clean. The smell at the door was old hickory smoke and dry salt and the cold mineral smell of stone. and underneath all of it a faint sweet trace of cured ham that had soaked into the very fibers of the cedar planks and would never leave. Verity stepped inside and stood in the middle of the floor for a long minute and breathed. She walked to the north wall, to the maple curing table. The single thick slab of seasoned hard maple ran 14 ft along the wall, 6 in thick, blackened with salt brine and ham fat at the surface and worn smooth at the spots where Mavis and Mavis's father and Caleb himself had stood for 100 years. Verity ran her palm slowly across the surface. A memory came back. Mavis, the summer Verity was 8, kneeling at the south end of the curing table and laying her hand flat on a particular white oak plank set into the slate floor at the table's foot. Your great-grandfather Caleb was a careful man, honey girl, when he laid this floor. In 1909, he set one plank loose over a stone cavity he had dug into the ground beneath the table. He told me about it the week before he died in 1962. He said, "It was where the smokehouse kept what could not be lost." I never lifted the plank. Verity had been 8. She had forgotten the story for 16 years. She knelt at the south end of the table. The slate floor was clean and smooth, set into the slate. At the foot of the table was a single wide plank of oak jointed flush, almost invisible against the dark stone with a small finger hole cut into one end. She slid her finger into the hole and lifted. The oak plank came up. Beneath it was a square, stone-lined cavity about 2 ft deep and 18 in across. At the bottom of the cavity in the back corner sat a tin box the size of a brick, a lid stamped Cale, of 1909. She lifted it out two-handed and set it in the gray November light. She lifted the lid. The oilcloth, bundle heavy in her hands, opened to reveal 240 gold coins stacked in even rows, Liberty pieces and half eagles, and a small handful of St. Gaudens double eagles in better condition than any she had ever seen. The coined eeler in Knoxville would later weigh the lot at 26,200. Beneath the bundle, a small leather-bound notebook held Caleb's original 1909 ham curing recipes. Every cure ratio to the gram, every smoking schedule by ham weight, and outside temperature, written in his careful Scots-Irish hand. And the leather-bound smoke book, Mavis's own ledger. Every ham she had ever cured recorded from 1960 to through 2008 in her tight slanted script. Beneath the ledger, an old sepia photograph showing a stern-eyed man in a black wool coat standing in front of the smokehouse in 1909. A salt tub in his hand. A 10-year-old girl in a pinafore standing beside him with the corner of a brass scale at her elbow. And on top of everything, sealed with deep brown wax, a folded letter with Verity's name across the front. Verity broke the wax with her thumbnail. She sat down on the wooden stool beside the curing table in the cold November light from the small east window and read the letter through. October 19th, 2008. Verity, by the time you find this, I will be gone and the smokehouse will have stood quiet long enough that your father will have known to give it to you. My father Caleb set this money under the floor in 1909 because he did not trust any American bank with his Scots-Irish money. He told me about it the week before he died in 1962 and made me promise not to lift the plank. I have kept the promise. The smokehouse fed us through every year of my life and most of yours. Your brothers will sell what they can, but this box they cannot sell because they do not know it is here. The recipes are Caleb's. The ledger is the record. Here hams again. If it suits you, honey. The smokehouse is yours. Verity Sutton Smokehouse, 19 October 2008. Verity closed the letter into the inside pocket of her grandmother's old faded forest gray wool Melton jacket. She did not cry. She walked over to the maple curing table and laid her palm flat on the worn black and amber surface, where Mavis had cured hams for 46 years and felt the 60 years of salt rubbed into the grain. The slight to thunder her flat hand. The smell of dry brine and hickory and cedar rising up from the table into the cold air. The maple was cool. The ware was perfect. To the cold November light over the smokehouse floor she said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Sutton. I will cure hams again." Beneath the photograph in the tin box she found a folded yellowed newspaper clipping. She had not seen at first. The clipping was from the Greenville Sun dated April 4th, 1996. The headline read, "7 Greene County families save farms with help from anonymous donor." The article said that during the height of the federal and bank foreclosure crisis, 7 small family farms in the upper Holston Valley, the Broadden Farm, the Tipton-Renfro Farm, the Phipps Farm, the Crouch Farm, the Renfro-McCall Farm, the Burchett Farm, and the Sevier Farm had each received an envelope of cash sufficient to bring their mortgage current, delivered without note or signature sometime between January and March of that year. The article ended with a quote from Mrs. Leila Broadden. "Whoever did this saved our farm. Whoever did this saved our marriage. We will spend the rest of our lives wondering whose hand it was, and we will spend the rest of our lives praying for that hand." Verity read clipping twice. She folded it slowly. She put it in the inside pocket of the jacket beside the letter. She drove back up the lane to the home farm. She let herself in the front door of the farmhouse with the key her father had given her in February. She walked through the empty front parlor and the empty dining room and the empty kitchen and the empty back hall to the small office at the back of the house where her father had kept his desk for 52 years. The desk was a heavy oak rolltop her grandfather Beaufort had built. The rolltop was down. She slid it up. On the green felt blotter sat a single sealed envelope with her name on the front in her father's slow, careful hand. She lifted the envelope. The flap was sealed with the same deep brown wax as Mavis's letter. Hollis had used the same wax stick her grandmother had used. Verity broke the wax with her thumbnail and read, "Verity, if you are reading this, you have found the smokehouse. And if you have found the smokehouse, you have found the tin box. And if you have found the tin box, you have found the clipping from 1996. The 7 families in that article were our neighbors. The hand was your grandmother's. The money was the smokehouse's. I helped her count it at the kitchen table on a January night in 1996, and again on a February night, and again on a March night. We never spoke of it after. Your mother knew. She helped your grandmother fold the cash. She did not tell your brothers. I did not tell your brothers. The smokehouse income that paid for those 7 families came out of the trade your grandmother taught you. I am not a man of words. I am sorry. I was not a man of more words for you. I have left you the smokehouse because the smokehouse is the only thing in this whole farm your grandmother would have wanted you to have. Your brothers do not know what the smokehouse is. They will never know. The decision to tell them or not is yours alone. I have left you what was your grandmother's. Hollis Sutton, your father, August 14, 2024. Verity sat for a long time at her father's desk in the late November afternoon light. Then she folded the letter into the inside pocket of the jacket, beside the first letter and the clipping. She closed the roll top. She walked back down the lane to the smokehouse and locked the door behind her. She drove the Ford the next Monday to the Greene County Federal Savings Bank in downtown Greenville with the tin box on the passenger seat. Mrs. Hattie Crouch, the branch manager, weighed the coins on the bank's brass scale, called the dealer in Knoxville, and confirmed 26,200. Verity deposited 25,000. and 500 and walked back to the truck with 700 folded into the inside pocket of the Melton jacket. Mrs. Crouch. Verity recognized the name from the clipping the moment she heard it. Had not said anything when she saw the dealer's total. She had just looked at Verity for a long moment over the brass scale, the way Mr. Otis Spenlin had looked at her at the conference table, and signed the receipt and pushed it across. The first month was Ray firing the smokehouse and Ray curing the curing table. The brick firebox had taken 13 years of moisture and 3 small cracks across the throat where the heat had concentrated. The cedar planks in the upper wall had pulled away from their nails into places. The slate roof had 3 cracked tiles that needed setting. Verity ordered fresh fire brick from a chimney supply in Johnson City for $85. She found a retired Greene County stonemason named Mr. Truth Burchett, 81. The name from the clipping again, who came down on a Wednesday and showed her how to reset the fire brick with high-temperature mortar. She nailed the cedar planks with copper roofing nails. She replaced the 3 slate tiles herself. She oiled the maple curing table with food-safe mineral oil rubbed in by hand over for evenings. She built a small clean fire of dry hickory chips in the firebox and ran her first cold smoke through the empty smokehouse, just to see the pale blue column climb out the roof vent again. It was perfect. She stepped out onto the gravel turnaround in the cold November dusk and watched the smoke rise. The cabin became hers a piece at a time across. That first winter, she brought down the small folding bed from the home farmhouse before her brother's real estate agent could photograph the back bedroom. She brought down a small-to-burner kerosene stove and set it on a cast iron stand by the east window. From a yard sale outside Moshim, she carried home a small kitchen table for $16. From a thrift shop on Main Street in Greenville, she carried home a wool quilt for $14. Mr. Burgett came back that next Sunday with a small cast iron parlor stove he had pulled out of his own back barn and installed it himself in the corner of the smokehouse, opposite the firebox, vented through the cedar wall, and would not take pay. Your grandmother put the roof back on my mama's farmhouse in 1986, he said. Just bring me coffee. She lay awake that first night on the folding bed by the east window. The slow tick of the parlor stove cooling. The wind moving through the cedar planks above. A barred owl called once in the woods toward the Holston River and was answered farther off. It was the first roof she had slept under as her own since the November her grandmother was buried. Things found their places. A forest gray Melton jacket went on a peg above the curing table. Caleb's empty tin box sat on the cedar shelf above the firebox. The brass saw trub took its old position, third tool from the left on the curing table. A new ledger went on the kitchen table, and Verity began entering her own hams. January 8, 2025. First short. Cure shoulder of the new season, £12, $52. Mr. Truth Burchett came every Saturday morning. He drove up the lane in a battered dark green 1970 for Chevy C10 he had owned for 50 years. He came up to the smokehouse with a thermos and a paper sack of his wife's biscuits. He took a cup at the table, set the biscuits on the curing table, said Mavis would have liked this, and drove home. In her second year, a heritage food editor from a Charleston magazine drove up from the low country in a white Subaru Outback. The magazine had been on a 2-year search for a Tennessee mountain smokehouse that still cured country hams entirely by hand to pre-1960s methods, and had spent 18 months trying every smokehouse from Cumberland Gap to Roanoke without finding what she was looking for. She walked the smokehouse, smelled the pale blue smoke, lifted a hanging ham, and pressed her thumb against the marbled bloom, and named her terms at the curing table. A feature article and a standing order of 20 long, cherished hams a year at $180 apiece, for a Charleston and restaurant group's holiday menu. Verity took her hand on it. The first Charleston check, when it cleared in March, paid for her second winter at the Smokehouse. The commissions grew. Mrs. Leila Brogdon, the name from the clipping, drove down from her granddaughter's place outside Bull's Gap in February of that first year with a jar of black walnut preserve and a story she had been carrying for 40 years. Verity made her coffee at the kitchen table and listened. Mrs. Brogdon left without ordering a ham. She had only wanted to sit in the Smokehouse one more time. She came back in November and ordered for short cures for her grandchildren and would not take a discount. Mr. Otis Penland hove out one Saturday in March with a mason jar of his late wife's paper jelly and the original 1909 hand-painted Sutton Smokehouse sign that he had bought at the estate sale of Buford Sutton's auction in 1972 and had been keeping in his law office hallway for 53 years. He gave it to her without taking gas money. A Knoxville food writer ran a feature and orders began arriving from across the South. Asheville, Atlanta, Birmingham, Memphis, Louisville, until she raised her per ham price by $12 and was still booked 9 months out. By the second autumn, she had a habit of sitting on the small front step of the Smokehouse in the last hour of daylight with a coffee mug warm in both hands. Bald Mountains had gone russet and brown with October. She thought of Mavis, of Caleb, whom she had never met, but whose hand had laid the curing table under her palm, of her father Hollis, whose decision in August of 2024 had handed her the only inheritance she had ever wanted, of the 7 families in 19 Texas, whose names she now knew by heart, and of the long and broken row of hands on the smoke that had finally come down to her own. That's the thing about the trade our grandmothers teach us to keep. We do not always know when we are 6 years old and standing at a maple curing table with our hand on our grandmother's belt, that the standing is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, rub by rub, and then 16 years after the old woman dies, we lift a plank she would not lift and find what she has left for us. And we understand what she has been teaching us. She had been teaching us that a country ham is a promise. The smoke keeps to the meat. She had been teaching us that the trade is not the ham. The trade is the patience. The trade is the hand that learned, the hand that teaches, and the hand that comes after. And sometimes the trade is also the hand that pays a neighbor's mortgage on a January night and never tells anyone whose hand it was. Her brothers got the farm. Her brothers got the timber. And the tractors. And the bank accounts. They got everything you could measure with money, and they laughed at the meat shed on the way out the door. What they did not get was the trade. What they did not get was the grandmother. What they did not get was the 7 families in 19 Texas. What they did not get was the hand that came after. Verity Sutton was 24 years old, and her father had just died. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on an old smokehouse on the northeast corner of the family farm in the Holston Valley of Greene County, Tennessee. It was the best $1 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, has anyone in your family ever quietly carried a kindness like that? We would love to read your stories. See you on the next quiet road.